Behind the golden gates and marble corridors of Europe's most powerful palaces lived women whose bodies carried secrets more devastating than any political scandal. These weren't just princesses and queens, they were living laboratories of genetic experimentation gone horribly wrong. For centuries, royal families believed that keeping bloodlines pure would preserve their divine right to rule, but instead they created a biological nightmare that would haunt generations of women who never chose their fate. Picture this, a young woman adorned in the finest silks, surrounded by unimaginable wealth, yet trapped in a body that betrays her at every turn. Her jaw cannot close properly, making eating a public humiliation. Her bones ache constantly from malformations that doctors cannot explain. When she tries to bear children, her body fails her repeatedly, each miscarriage, not just a personal tragedy, but a dynastic catastrophe. This was the reality for countless royal women whose only crime was being born into families obsessed with genetic purity. The ancient Egyptians started this deadly tradition, but they had no idea they were conducting the world's most destructive genetic experiment. Pharaohs married their sisters not out of love, but because they believed mixing their divine blood with anyone else's would dilute their connection to the gods. The Ptolemaic dynasty perfected this practice, creating family trees that looked more like genetic spiderwebs than proper lineages. Cleopatra VII, the last pharaoh of Egypt, wasn't just the product of one incestuous marriage, but the culmination of 300 years of siblings marrying siblings, fathers marrying daughters and uncles, taking nieces as wives. Modern genetic analysis of royal mummies reveals the horrifying truth: over 60% of these children died before reaching 5 years old, their tiny bodies unable to cope with the genetic chaos coursing through their veins. But Egypt was just the beginning. European royal houses took this practice and transformed it into an art form of self-destruction. The Habsburg dynasty created a system so closed that by the 16th century, virtually every member of the family was related in multiple ways. Charles V of Spain could trace his lineage back to the same ancestors through dozens of different paths, each one representing another layer of genetic compression. The women of these families paid the highest price. Maria of Austria, born in 1528, was the daughter of first cousins who were themselves products of strategic inbreeding. Her health problems were so severe that court physicians kept detailed records of her suffering, documenting symptoms that modern doctors recognize as classic signs of genetic disorders caused by consanguinity. She experienced chronic respiratory problems, skeletal deformities, and a reproductive system so compromised that pregnancy became a life-threatening gamble. Joanna of Castile, remembered by history as Joanna the Mad, represents one of the most tragic examples of how inbreeding destroyed lives. Her mental instability wasn't divine punishment or feminine weakness, as court historians claimed, but the direct result of generations of genetic compression. Modern psychiatrists studying her case believe she suffered from a combination of genetic predispositions to mental illness that were amplified by the limited gene pool of her ancestry. The Habsburg jaw became the most visible symbol of this genetic catastrophe. What started as a slight underbite in early generations evolved into a deformity so pronounced that descendants could barely chew solid food. Charles II of Spain, the final Habsburg ruler, was so genetically compromised that he was nicknamed the Bewitched. His autopsy revealed organs that barely functioned, a brain that had never developed properly, and a body that was essentially a medical miracle for surviving as long as it did. These physical deformities were just the surface manifestations of deeper genetic problems. Habsburg women experienced fertility rates that were catastrophically low compared to the general population. Many spent decades in marriage without producing a single child, leading to public humiliation and private anguish that court records barely hint at. Margaret Theresa of Austria married her uncle and died at 21 after multiple miscarriages, her body unable to sustain pregnancies because of the genetic burden she carried. The Bourbon dynasty inherited many of these problems when they gained control of Spanish territories. Marie Antoinette, perhaps the most famous victim of this genetic legacy, struggled for 7 years to become pregnant after her marriage to Louis XVI. Court physicians documented her physical abnormalities, including skeletal irregularities and hormonal imbalances that modern doctors recognize as symptoms of inbreeding depression. Her daughter, Marie-Thérèse Charlotte, carried this genetic burden into the next generation. Despite a long marriage, she never produced children, her reproductive system apparently too damaged by centuries of genetic compression to function normally. She became a living symbol of how the sins of previous generations could destroy the hopes of the innocent. The Romanov dynasty faced their own genetic nightmare in the form of hemophilia, a blood clotting disorder that turned minor cuts into potentially fatal hemorrhages. This condition arrived in the Russian royal family through Alexandra Feodorovna, who carried the gene from her grandmother, Queen Victoria of England. Victoria herself was the product of first-cousin marriage, and she unknowingly spread this genetic time bomb through royal families across Europe. The 4 Grand Duchesses Olga, Tatiana Maria, and Anastasia represented the feminine side of this tragedy. Each carried the hemophilia gene, meaning any children they might have had faced a 50% chance of inheriting this potentially lethal condition. These young women lived with the knowledge that their bodies carried a genetic curse that could kill their future sons. Their brother Alexei embodied the horror of this condition. Born in 1904, he was the long-awaited heir to the Russian throne, but his life was a constant battle against his own biology. Any rough play, any minor accident could trigger internal bleeding that might prove fatal. Palace physicians maintained 24-hour watches, knowing that at any moment they might need to fight for the young prince's life. The science behind these tragedies is both fascinating and terrifying. When closely related individuals reproduce, they dramatically increase the chances that harmful recessive genes will be expressed in their offspring. These genetic time bombs lie dormant in healthy populations, but emerge with devastating effect when the gene pool becomes too shallow. Every human carries several lethal recessive genes, but in normal populations, the chances of 2 people carrying the same harmful mutations are minimal. In royal families practicing systematic inbreeding, these odds skyrocketed. Studies of European royal genealogies show that by the 18th century, some family lines had coefficient of inbreeding higher than what modern geneticists consider safe for laboratory mouse breeding programs. The physical manifestations were horrifying but predictable. Prognathism, the medical term for the Habsburg jaw, occurs when recessive genes affecting facial bone development are allowed to express themselves without genetic diversity to moderate their effects. Modern analysis shows that this trait appeared in over 90% of Habsburg descendants by the 17th century. Infertility became endemic in these bloodlines. Normal human fertility rates hover around 80 to 90%, but among European royal women of the 17th and 18th centuries, successful reproduction rates dropped to less than 40%. Many princesses spent their entire adult lives in marriages that produced no children, their bodies unable to sustain pregnancies due to genetic incompatibilities. Mental health problems were equally devastating, but often hidden from public view. Court records describe numerous princes and princesses who exhibited behaviors that modern psychiatrists recognize as symptoms of genetic disorders affecting brain development. Many were quietly sequestered in remote palace wings, their conditions attributed to divine displeasure rather than biological reality. The hemophilia that plagued the Romanovs and other European royal families demonstrates how a single genetic mutation can spread through interconnected bloodlines like a virus. Queen Victoria herself, the product of first-cousin marriage, carried the gene and passed it to 3 of her 9 children. Through strategic marriages designed to strengthen political alliances, she inadvertently spread this genetic curse to royal families in Russia, Spain, and Germany. Alexandra of Russia lived with the terrible knowledge that she had brought this curse to the Romanov line. Every pregnancy was a genetic lottery where the stakes were her child's life. When Alexei was born with hemophilia, she blamed herself for his suffering, not understanding that she was simply the latest link in a chain of genetic compression that stretched back generations. The women in these families faced impossible choices. They were raised from birth to understand that their primary purpose was producing heirs, but their genetics made this goal increasingly difficult or dangerous. Many endured years of medical interventions that we would consider torture today, all in desperate attempts to fulfill their reproductive duties. Court physicians, working with medieval understanding of genetics, often blamed these women for their fertility problems. Marie Antoinette was publicly mocked for her inability to conceive with political enemies, suggesting she was cursed or medically defective. The reality was that her body was fighting against centuries of genetic damage, but this scientific understanding wouldn't emerge for another century. The psychological toll was immense. These women lived with the knowledge that they carried genetic time bombs that could affect not just their own children, but generations yet unborn. Palace records describe numerous cases of depression, anxiety, and what modern doctors would recognize as post-traumatic stress related to reproductive trauma. Many royal women became obsessed with producing healthy heirs, undergoing increasingly desperate medical treatments. Isabella of Portugal, mother of Philip II of Spain, subjected herself to painful medical procedures throughout multiple pregnancies, all while dealing with the genetic legacy of her own Habsburg ancestry. Her children inherited not just her royal titles, but her genetic burden. The irony of these practices becomes clear when we understand their original motivation. Royal families believed they were preserving something divine and pure in their bloodlines, but they were actually concentrating genetic damage with each generation. What they thought was refinement was actually biological degradation on a massive scale. Some families recognized the problems earlier than others. The English royal family, after observing the devastating effects of inbreeding in continental dynasties, began moderating their marriage practices in the 18th century. However, even this gradual change came too late for many women who had already been born into genetically compromised bloodlines. The French Revolution and other political upheavals of the 18th and 19th centuries swept away many of these inbred dynasties, but not before claiming countless female victims. The guillotine that ended Marie Antoinette's life was in many ways more merciful than the genetic prison she had been born into. Modern genetic counseling has revealed just how devastating these practices were. Computer models of Habsburg family trees show levels of genetic compression that approach the limits of what human biology can tolerate. Some descendants had genetic diversity levels lower than what occurs naturally in isolated island populations. Despite being born into the heart of European civilization, the Habsburg jaw has become a textbook example of how recessive genetic traits express themselves in inbred populations. Medical students study portraits of Charles II of Spain to understand how generations of genetic compression can distort human development. His face wasn't just disfigured, it was a roadmap of genetic damage accumulated over centuries. Today's royal families have largely abandoned these practices, but the genetic legacy lingers in unexpected ways. Modern genetic testing has revealed that some European noble families still carry higher rates of certain genetic disorders, ancestral echoes of their inbred past. These bloodlines serve as natural laboratories for studying how genetic diversity affects human health. The women who suffered through these genetic experiments were often extraordinarily intelligent and capable individuals trapped in failing bodies. Many showed remarkable resilience, managing to find meaning and purpose despite their physical limitations. Their stories remind us that genetic health isn't just a medical issue, but a fundamental human right. Contemporary genetics has vindicated the instinctive revulsion that many people feel toward incest. Our biological programming evolved to prevent exactly the kind of genetic catastrophes that plagued royal families. The taboos surrounding close relative marriage exist because populations that practiced such unions consistently suffered reduced fitness and eventual extinction. These historical examples continue to inform modern medical practice. Genetic counselors use the royal examples to explain why genetic diversity is crucial for healthy reproduction. The Habsburg jaw appears in medical textbooks as a cautionary tale about the consequences of ignoring biological realities in favor of social conventions. The legacy of these genetically cursed royal women extends beyond medicine into our understanding of human rights and reproductive autonomy. Their stories illustrate how political systems that treat women as breeding stock inevitably create suffering on a massive scale. They were victims not just of bad genetics, but of social systems that valued bloodline purity over human well-being. Understanding this history helps us appreciate why modern genetic counseling exists and why reproductive freedom matters. Every woman today who can choose her partner based on love, rather than political calculation, benefits from the hard lessons learned through centuries of royal genetic experimentation. The price of that knowledge was paid by generations of women who never had a choice in determining their own reproductive destiny. The Spanish Infanta Margarita Teresa serves as another devastating example of how genetic compression destroyed young lives. Born in 1651, she was the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria. Painted famously by Velázquez, her portraits reveal subtle signs of the genetic burden she carried. Her peculiar facial structure, the pale complexion that court physicians constantly worried about, and the health crises that plagued her short life, all pointed to the devastating effects of Habsburg inbreeding. Margarita Teresa was married to her uncle Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, when she was just 15 years old. The marriage was celebrated as a diplomatic triumph, but it became a biological disaster. Her first pregnancy ended in miscarriage, followed by another, then another. When she finally gave birth to a daughter, the child survived only 6 years before succumbing to the genetic weaknesses inherited from generations of inbreeding. Margarita Teresa herself died at 21, her body unable to withstand the complications of repeated pregnancies, complicated by genetic disorders. Court physicians of the time documented her symptoms with increasing alarm. She suffered from what they described as melancholia periods of profound sadness that modern psychiatrists recognize as clinical depression linked to genetic factors. Her physical development was delayed. Her immune system was so compromised that minor illnesses nearly killed her repeatedly, and her reproductive system was so damaged that pregnancy became a form of Russian roulette. The tragic irony was that everyone involved understood they were witnessing something unnatural, but the political pressures to maintain bloodline purity overruled biological common sense. Letters between royal courts of the period reveal growing awareness that something was fundamentally wrong with these systematic breeding practices, yet they continued because the alternative meant admitting that centuries of royal tradition were based on a catastrophic misunderstanding of genetics. Anna of Austria, another victim of this system, lived through what court records describe as a nightmare of reproductive failure. Born in 1634 to Spanish Habsburgs, she married Louis XIV of France in a union designed to end decades of warfare between the two kingdoms. What should have been a celebration of peace became a demonstration of genetic incompatibility. Of her 6 pregnancies, only 1 child survived to adulthood, and that son died before reaching 40, apparently from complications related to the genetic burden he inherited. Anna's physicians kept detailed records of her health struggles documents that read like a medical horror story. She experienced what they called floating kidney, a condition where organs shifted position due to weakened connective tissues. Her bones were so fragile that she suffered multiple fractures from activities that should have been completely safe. Most tragically, each pregnancy became progressively more dangerous as her body struggled against genetic programming that made healthy reproduction nearly impossible. The psychological documents from her time reveal a woman tormented by the knowledge that her primary duty as queen was the one thing her body could not reliably accomplish. Court observers noted her increasing withdrawal from public life, her obsession with religious practices that promised divine intervention in her reproductive struggles, and her growing conviction that she was being punished for sins she could not identify. Isabella Clara Eugenia, daughter of Philip II of Spain, represents another chapter in this genetic tragedy. Born in 1566, she carried the accumulated genetic damage of multiple generations of Habsburg intermarriage. Her father was himself the product of strategic inbreeding, and her mother came from a Portuguese royal line that had practiced similar genetic concentration. Isabella's life became a case study in how genetic disorders could manifest in subtle but devastating ways. Unlike some of her relatives who showed obvious physical deformities, Isabella's genetic burden expressed itself primarily through reproductive failure and immune system collapse. She married Albert VII of Austria, her cousin, in a union that everyone hoped would produce healthy heirs for the Spanish Netherlands. Instead, it produced a series of miscarriages and stillbirths that left both parents increasingly desperate and politically vulnerable. Modern analysis of Isabella's preserved correspondence reveals a woman acutely aware that something was fundamentally wrong with her ability to produce healthy children. She consulted physicians across Europe, underwent treatments that ranged from herbal remedies to procedures that would be considered barbaric today, and eventually resigned herself to the possibility that God intended her royal line to end with her generation. The genetic science behind these tragedies reveals patterns that were invisible to contemporaries, but are crystal clear to modern researchers. Coefficient of inbreeding calculations for the Habsburg family show that by the 17th century, some individuals had genetic diversity levels comparable to what occurs in isolated populations after several generations of extreme bottlenecking. Charles II of Spain, for example, had a coefficient of inbreeding of 0.254, meaning he was more inbred than the offspring of siblings would be in a normal population. This level of genetic compression created what scientists call inbreeding depression on a massive scale. Every biological system became compromised. Immune function declined with each generation, making royal children increasingly susceptible to diseases that rarely affected the general population. Fertility rates plummeted as reproductive systems struggled with genetic incompatibilities that made conception and successful pregnancy increasingly unlikely. Skeletal development became particularly problematic. The Habsburg jaw was just the most visible manifestation of systematic bone malformation that affected entire generations. X-rays of royal remains show bones that developed abnormally, joints that never formed properly, and skeletal structures that were fundamentally incompatible with normal physical function. Many royal women spent their entire adult lives dealing with chronic pain from bones that had grown incorrectly due to genetic programming that was supposed to govern normal development, but instead created biological chaos. The neurological consequences were equally devastating, but often hidden from public view. Court records hint at numerous cases of what we would now recognize as autism spectrum disorders, intellectual disabilities, and psychiatric conditions linked to genetic factors. Many royal children were quietly removed from succession lines, not because of political considerations, but because their genetic burden made them unsuitable for public life. The reproductive consequences extended beyond simple infertility. When pregnancies did occur, they often resulted in conditions that modern medicine recognizes as genetic incompatibilities. Miscarriage rates among royal women were 3 to 4 times higher than in the general population. When children survived to birth, infant mortality rates were catastrophic, with many royal babies dying within days or weeks of birth from organ failures that stemmed directly from genetic disorders. Even those children who survived infancy often faced shortened lifespans due to genetic burdens that manifested as they matured. Royal genealogies show consistently reduced lifespans compared to noble families that practiced more genetically diverse marriage patterns. The very bloodlines that were supposed to carry divine mandates were systematically destroying themselves through ignorance of biological realities. The transition away from these practices didn't happen overnight. Royal families across Europe gradually recognized that their traditional marriage patterns were creating more problems than they solved, but changing centuries of established practice required overcoming enormous cultural and political resistance. Many families continued practicing modified forms of consanguinity well into the 19th century, producing additional generations of genetically compromised offspring. The English royal family provides an interesting case study in gradual genetic recovery. After observing the catastrophic effects of extreme inbreeding in continental dynasties, they began moderating their marriage practices while still maintaining political alliances through strategic unions. This middle path reduced the most severe genetic problems while preserving many traditional royal privileges. However, even this moderated approach had consequences. The haemophilia that Queen Victoria carried and transmitted throughout European royalty stemmed from genetic mutations that were amplified by generations of reduced genetic diversity. Her descendants paid the price for centuries of careful bloodline management that prioritized political considerations over biological health. The Russian experience with haemophilia demonstrates how a single genetic disorder could destabilize an entire empire. Alexandra's desperate search for treatments for her son Alexei led her to Rasputin, whose influence over the royal family contributed to the political chaos that ultimately enabled the Russian Revolution. In this sense, centuries of genetic compression didn't just harm individual women, but contributed to historical events that reshaped entire continents. These stories remind us that genetic health isn't an abstract scientific concept, but a fundamental requirement for human flourishing. The royal women who suffered through centuries of genetic experimentation were victims of systems that treated reproductive decisions as political calculations rather than biological realities. Their pain, their lost children, and their shortened lives serve as permanent testimony to the importance of genetic diversity and reproductive autonomy in creating healthy human populations.